Hello everyone, and welcome to Tortoise on a day when there is at least some good news. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe is back in the UK. The Ministry of Defence here in the UK says that the Russian advance is, quote, largely stalled on all fronts in Ukraine. And as of the last count, about 120,000 people, maybe more now, have signed up for the UK government's Homes for Ukraine scheme, which is designed, better late than never, to welcome large numbers of Ukrainian refugees who do not necessarily already have personal connections with this country. But a few more numbers off the top. As of the last count, barely 5,500 visas had actually been issued, 20,000 being processed. Not surprisingly, it takes a while because the application form is 30 pages long, and there are 3 million refugees and counting. And the number of pages, by the way, on an EU visa application form for Ukrainian refugees is 0, because there isn't one, at least not to get into the EU. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor here at Tortoise, and I'm delighted to be joined by some great guests who I will introduce you to in just a second. I think if I can just stay with those numbers for a little bit, I think while that the very fast uptake, relatively speaking, of the Homes for Ukraine scheme, a lot of people and organizations registering on the government website is in a sense heartening. I don't think they necessarily answer the question that we've put to ourselves. Does Britain really want refugees? I think there's a lot to go at here. Do the British people really want Ukrainian refugees? Does the British government, does the British bureaucracy that sits between people and government? And is the UK response so far fundamentally different from that of the rest of, I was going to say the rest of the EU, from the EU? And if so, why? And not incidentally, whatever we do, how do we make it safe for the refugees themselves, and especially the young and the vulnerable? Those of you who've been to Think-Ins before know the drill. Please dive in. We want to hear from you. Use your electronic hand or the chat or both. I must make a point of opening the chat so I can see it, but I will be joined, I think, by my colleague Zav, who is monitoring the chat. Tell us what you think, and as importantly, tell us what you think we as a newsroom should be trying to find out in this rapidly evolving story. We are joined by, in no particular order, Hannah Green from City of Sanctuary, by Enver Solomon, Chief Executive of the Refugee Council, by Daniel Sohedge of Love 146 or 146, a human rights organization which works to end child trafficking, an increasing risk in any refugee crisis of this kind, and by Maria Romanenko, who has lived this crisis, and we'll be hearing from her in just a little bit about what that actually involved. But without further ado, let me come first to Hannah, if I may, because I know apart from anything, you have to go early. You work, and I guess are braced for the new influx of refugees. What do you make of the Homes for Ukraine scheme in as far as we understand it so far? Is it up to the task? And if you don't mind sort of elaborating a little bit, what does it tell us in answer to the question, does Britain really want Ukrainian refugees?
I mean, I think so far what we can tell from this scheme is the public want to help. There's been a huge outpouring of people obviously offering to host. But right now, from what we do know, the government seems to be talking the talk maybe and not walking the walk. Hosting in the community can be incredibly fantastic, and there's a lot of expertise in the refugee sector who can make that happen. But until we have the details of this particular scheme, it's very hard to engage with it. It was announced on Monday, and as of yet, there are so many unanswered questions and a lot of really serious concerns that I'm sure we'll unpack later on. But yeah, the lion's share of this hosting scheme is supposedly going to be done by the refugee sector and faith groups. But from what I understand, I don't think any of those groups were actually consulted beforehand. So without this lack of notice and without this detail, we're kind of at sea. And I mean, what comes with that, typically, pace and scale are the enemy of safety. So this scheme is very worrying in terms of safeguarding. And I'm sure Daniel will know a lot more than me in terms of this. But we're talking about people who may well have incredibly complex trauma, who will require specialized support. They may have lost their homes, they may have lost loved ones, they may have had to leave behind family members. And so hosting isn't just about providing a roof over somebody's head, it's helping someone to restart their life and helping them to recover and to rebuild. And that's a really serious job. That requires specialized knowledge, and it can't just be left to ordinary people. Yeah.
Hannah, what do you make of the basic principle that of putting voluntarism and, frankly, groups like yours at the heart of the government response?
I mean, the government has to do more. Like right now, as it stands, none of us understand how this scheme will work. Like there is a database now of however many thousands of people who are open to hosting, but we have no idea how that information is going to be decimated, going to be shared with amongst the sector. I mean, there are even concerns about how legally that information will be shared with GDPR. So it's a good idea, but we don't know how it's going to work in real terms.
And you were not consulted as an organization before it was announced?
No.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's move on to Enver Solomon if we can. Enver, I gather that you are already in the room. Thank you so much in the circumstances. It's great that you're here. Do you feel you understand the Homes for Ukraine scheme, and were you consulted in advance?
We were asked to join a meeting rather late in the day, and we were told what the plan was. We weren't in the room designing it and co-developing it with government. I think, government felt the pressure of public opinion, felt the pressure from their own backbench MPs when the initial family visa scheme was found wanting, in the sense that it wasn't going to be welcoming large numbers of people, and they decided to urgently think of a mechanism that would allow them to bring in more people, and they came up with this sponsorship scheme. I think there are a number of challenges, not least the fact that people still need a visa, unlike in EU countries where they've waived all visas, and actually accessing a visa is complicated. There's a whole pro bono group of lawyers that have set themselves up to advise Ukrainians on how to get visas to get to the UK, and it won't reach very vulnerable children or young people or even adults. If you're a child who's alone, and there are tens of thousands of children we understand who are traveling out of Ukraine as refugees alone, you want to come to the UK, you speak some English, how you access a visa is going to be really challenging and almost impossible. So my view is that they should have waived visas. They should have given a safe and quick, rapid, frictionless route for people to get to the UK, and then match them with people in the community.
And explain to us, if you understand it, the system by which someone in your or our position, keen to host a refugee or refugee family, what are we supposed to do next after registering? Because I confess it was only today that I learned that nobody comes to me with a name and a suggestion. I have to go to the system.
That's right.
With a named refugee or family. How does that work?
Right. So the way the government has decided to run the scheme is that actually you, as a host, as a sponsor, you in effect have to find a Ukrainian refugee that you name, that you then sponsor to come to the UK. So it's actually quite restrictive in that regards, because as you say, you know, if I'm sat in Bristol, Cambridge, you know, Lincolnshire, Wales, wherever, Newcastle, the Highlands of Scotland, I want to welcome a Ukrainian refugee into my home, I've got to find one and name them. And that is really challenging and quite limiting, which is why, you know, we've been advocating waive visas for a limited period of time, allow any Ukrainian to come here who wants to, and then match them in a more controlled, structured way with individuals that want to sponsor them and give them a roof over their head. And I recognize the point that was making earlier by Hannah, that there's potential issues here around safeguarding, around vulnerable people being potentially put at risk. And I think it does need more structure. Local authorities need to be able to know who's staying where, in which houses in their communities, so they can follow up with visits. So there's a mechanism of some oversight. You know, I'm not trying to put bureaucratic hurdles in the way. And critically, there needs to be a pathway for Ukrainian refugees to independent living, because many of them, and our experience with working with refugees, this is the case, particularly those that might speak some English, that might want to get a job, they want to move into independent living as quickly as possible. That is the case with Afghans we've been working with, who've come here and they can speak English. They want to move into independent living. They want to get their own home. They want to try and find work. They want to try and rebuild their lives in the way they were living them in Ukraine just a month ago, remember, like you or I or anyone listening to this. And in order to do that, they need to be able to get into a home as quickly as possible. But one of the biggest mistakes and errors with this scheme is it seems the government has failed to allow people to access housing benefit immediately. And if they can't do that, they can't get onto the private rented sector, they can't get their own accommodation. If the relationship with the sponsor breaks down, the risk is that they could be homeless. So I think the government needs to try and make some adjustments to this as quickly as possible so that it supports Ukrainians to rebuild their lives in the best possible way.
Thank you. And we're going to ask Daniel in just a second about safeguarding. But while we're talking on the question of housing benefits specifically, Michael Gove stood up in the Commons and listed benefits, broadly defined, health and employment. Refugees under this scheme will have access to all of those and other support. Are you saying that that does not include, initially at least, access to housing benefits?
That's what I've been told, and I've been told that by government officials that are working on this scheme. They're trying to resolve that as we speak. My understanding is I think there's quite a lot of wrangling, discussion going on within government, not least over the safeguarding issue and whether there should be DBS checks, so a higher level of check than simply a check on the police national computer. But yeah, that as it stands and as I understand it, the way the scheme is currently set up is they couldn't apply for housing benefit as soon as they got to the UK if they chose to do that and wanted to do that.
Now, of course, if they could, they would run immediately into the systemic problem of a lack of housing across the board, council housing available for refugees wherever they come from. Do you think that's slowing them down on that?
Well, I mean, it depends which part of the country you're in, and you can access universal credit with the housing element and go in on the private rental market. Refugees who come through the asylum system who then get granted permission to stay in refugee status have to do that anyway because they lose the support, the £6 a day they've been having when in the asylum system and the accommodation they've had through that. So it's not unusual for refugees to move into private rented accommodation, to move onto universal credit. It is perfectly possible to do that. And actually the current community sponsorship scheme that has been running since the Syrian refugee crisis back in 2016 operates whereby people come together in a community. They provide a circle of support around refugees who have been mainly arriving from in and around Syria, and they ensure that they've got accommodation on the private rental market, that their universal credit application is in train so they can pay for that private rental accommodation, and they support them to orientate themselves, to get their kids into school, to find work, to get all the things they need to start rebuilding their lives. So we can do that. There's a model for doing it. This scheme just needs to add that element into it as well, and to not just have a single accommodation route, which is all about a room in someone's house.
Right. Which leads us neatly back to safeguarding. Daniel Sohedge with Love 146. There's a tension here, isn't there, between the potentially overwhelming need to go fast because of the sheer numbers of people and the urgency of need, and the need to keep people safe, which, as Hannah was saying, you risk forgetting about if you go too fast. How do we square that circle?
There's always a balance to be had, but safeguarding can never be looked at as the secondary aspect, which it seems to be in this case. We do have mechanisms in place. We've seen projects before whereby local authorities can rapidly respond if there's the input to actually help them do that from the start, to do the checks, to make sure that people can be integrated within the community. The model is there, but it does take a lot of work to run it, make sure it's done, and that needs to be done from the start, because if you try and bolt it on afterwards, you start to have gaps coming in which people could slip through, and wider issues start to make it harder. So if you do it at this point, before we actually start running the scheme, it becomes a lot smoother and it doesn't slow it down. But if you have to do it at some point, so this is the fastest way to do it.
You say the model is there. Where is that? Can you point to an example at scale in this country?
We've had, it's variously known as the Amnesty Project, and we've seen significant numbers of people in the past being brought in through that and being able to be integrated successfully within the community through not just sponsorship, but multi-agency and multidisciplinary links, NGOs, local authorities, working together, close cohesion, to make sure the safeguarding is there and people are supported.
And I mean, in all candor, if we had 200,000 Ukrainian refugees entering over the next few months, is there the capacity there to do the work?
We'd need to put more resources into it. That's definitely the case for that sort of numbers, but we aren't about 200,000 coming in one go though. So you have to look at how many people are coming originally. Now I agree with Ember that we should be looking at waiving visas in order to ensure more people can come. There's issues there, but you need that safeguarding in place as well for them. So it's that looking at how many are going to come across in each wave and how we provide that safeguarding at any one point.
Okay, just before we come to Maria, one more question, Daniel. We've been pretty focused on the UK for the last 20 minutes. Take a step back, look at what's happening in Europe from what we know of it. Is trafficking and safeguarding lapses going to be the next horror story from Poland and Romania?
We're already seeing the stories coming out with the issues. In any conflict zone, it becomes conflicts are a major driver of trafficking. They're a fundamental driver, not just the initial conflict, but as people seek safety. We've seen a story recently in Ireland of people risks of exploitation increasing. So yes, this is going to become a huge issue unless there is an EU and UK wide sort of focus on combating it and targeting traffickers.
Is it an inevitable result of moving as fast as governments have moved to respond in Europe? I mean, does it amount to an argument for having moved slower?
It's not inevitable. It's an argument for ensuring that we have structures in place. We know that situations can occur. We saw with Afghanistan, for example, what happens when a situation deteriorates rapidly. So we have that ability to say, we need to have the structures that we can rapidly implement across multiple countries to safeguard people, to identify signs of trafficking, and to identify where the particular risk points are.
Thank you so much. So we've heard a bit about the UK government's plans, which are still evolving. Let's be frank. Let's come to Maria Romanenko, joining us from Manchester. Glad you're there and glad you're with us. Tell us your story. Where and when did you start?
Thank you, Giles. So we started obviously like on the 23rd of February. We were in Kiev with my British partner. We happened to be in Poland before that, so we just flew in on the 23rd of February, the day before the all-out invasion started. And there were some warnings that something will be happening overnight. And then I had a conversation with my dad, who said that central Kiev, which is where I live normally, is not going to be a safe place that night. So we decided to move like 40 minutes car drive outside of Kiev where my dad lives, and we stayed with him. And we woke up to the news that the all-out invasion happened. And that's where my partner, he said that we need to get going and leave Ukraine, go to Western Ukraine first to Lviv, and then cross the border. Because not only Jez was caught up in a war, he was caught up in the war in a country that he doesn't have much attachment to. So that's why he was so firm on having to leave. If it wasn't for him, I would be probably staying because my family is still there. You know, for me, it's more important to be with my family, with my close people who are close to me than being in safety. So after that, we made it to Poland after basically 40 hours of making our way from Kiev all the way to the border, the Polish side of the border.
And can I just ask, moving fairly swiftly there, did you manage to get ahead of the worst of the bottlenecks at the border?
It was, basically like most of the things. The journey from Kiev to Lviv took us twice what it would normally take because of the traffic and on the roads. Then it took us a further 23 hours on foot at the actual pedestrian border where we were crossing, all because there were just a crazy amount of people there, and it was ridiculously understaffed. There were only like 3 or 4 sort of border guards on the Ukrainian side, and then there were only like 4 people checking the documents, and all of that was like tediously long, and people were pushing, and it was just very unsafe environment with no food or water or even toilet facilities. So we kind of, I think, got probably just before the worst time for crossing, because we started sort of leaving Kiev on the first day, and I think probably most people started doing so on the second to fourth day or something like that. That's probably when the biggest influx of people trying to leave was. So I think we just got it before the worst times, but we also kind of wasn't the prettiest time for us, right. I would say, being there.
And from the outset, your goal was to get to the UK because that's where your partner is from. Where was your first encounter with the UK immigration system?
Well, my first encounter probably was way before that, in early February, when I actually applied for a visitor visa without actually, expecting the war to happen or hoping that it wouldn't happen, even though it was there were lots of warnings in the media. So I applied for a visitor visa early February from Kiev, and didn't hear back. Normally it takes like 2.5 weeks to get the visitor visa, but I was not hearing back it was already 3 weeks when I made it to Poland. So my application was still at the decision-making process. So in Poland, we spent 4 nights, and out of those 4 nights, 2 of them were spent in Warsaw, which is where we went to the British Embassy in Warsaw to ask about my visa. And by that point, our story was like highly publicized everywhere. Like all the media had it and were reporting on us, which I think what is like really, really helped us, because we went to the embassy, and had I been on my own, nobody at the embassy would even talk to me because I'm Ukrainian, and they have this very strict no British passport, no talking to you policy. So we went together, and they basically talked to Jez there, and I think Jez probably can talk a bit more about this part.
Yeah, so we arrived at the British Embassy. Initially, we tried to get them to talk to us in general, and they didn't want to talk to us. It turns out that Boris Johnson and Liz Truss were heading towards the embassy to do a press conference at the time, so we had to wait for sort of them to arrive. We spoke to the embassy, there was a sizable queue outside the embassy, largely from people who had a slight British connection or who wanted to come to Britain, and the embassy was simply sending them away and telling them to go to the visa centre on the other side of the city. We spoke to somebody at the embassy who took our details, took Maria's details, and said he would look into the case. Equally at that time, our MP's office was calling the Home Office, And equally, we had maybe 10 media organisations equally calling the Home Office, saying that they were writing a piece about our process at the moment, and could they get a quote from the Home Office. Several hours later, 6 or 7 hours later, we actually we found out that essentially Maria's visa, whilst had been granted in theory, the process appears to be that once it's granted by the Home Office, it then gets sent to the visa application centre. It looks, but nobody can tell us, that it was sent back to Kiev. But of course, Kiev is shut, and you couldn't get there, and they can't reissue it. So using a lot of convincing, the Home Office issued what's known as a visa waiver. So we were allowed to fly on a specific flight to England to sort of essentially try, but that itself is quite fraught.
So you were spared the to and fro, which we heard about for many refugees trying to get into the UK, for example, from Channel ports to Paris or Brussels. But as I understand it, having got your visa waiver, then there was then a problem at the airport on arrival.
Yeah, so when we arrived, they were basically sort of started looking at my passport and they were like, where's the visa? And obviously, whilst we know that the visa was granted to me because the British Embassy confirmed it, there's no physical proof of it because it's somewhere, you know, we don't know where it is. So we kind of explained that we have the visa waiver, and to which they were just kind of like, where is it then? We're like, well, it's a visa waiver. It's not something you can show. Like, do you have an email about it? It's like, no, because it's in the system. You know, you should be able to see it in the system. And that's basically when they had to get permission from authority, whom I'm assuming they emailed the authority to ask specifically for permission for me to cross the border, and that took 2.5 hours. And during those 2.5 hours, the counterterrorism police came to check on me whether I'm not a terrorist. And I studied in the UK before, like I spent 5 years in the UK, so it just seemed quite excessive. Especially when you guys have been talking here about checks for people who will be hosting Ukrainians. I feel like at the moment it seems like there's more checks for Ukrainians who are coming into the country, even if they, you know, even if they're just coming as tourists or coming on family visas. And most of these people will be like women, you know, who have husbands here or have family here or coming with children. So yeah, the process at the airport, I mean, the counterterrorism police, they weren't horrible to me. They were nice and pleasant, but still, you know, it took us 2.5 hours to sort of be allowed to enter the country.
Now, I want to come in a second to Paul Butler as a trustee of the system that we've been talking about beforehand. But Maria, you said in the chat before we started talking, and forgive me if I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but there are a lot of people, I think, who will want to be involved in the conversation, that now that you're here, you are keen to help. How do you understand the system as it is now, and how do you plan to help?
Well, my partner has had applied for the family, sorry, what is it called again? The houses for Ukrainians system. Yeah. So obviously, even before we started dating, Des visited Ukraine a few times, and he's got many friends there. So he made it, you know, very clear to all of his friends straight away when sort of the all-out war broke out that they welcome to come to the UK, that he's going to do the best, even if, you know, regardless of whether it's him doing something or if you know somebody who can help, that we will be happy to help. So, and we personally know a few people as well who said that they are happy to sign up for the scheme to host Ukrainians. So we've just been doing that, and yeah, we're happy to, you know, at the moment we haven't seen anybody, even like lots of people I know, I've sort of offered the help, but nobody's really been taking up the help from Ukraine. So maybe that's still to come, but we are happy to help in the ways that we can. So opening up our home is the most obvious way.
So you've both seen what has been going on at the border between Ukraine and Poland, and you've both experienced the UK borders reaction to the whole crisis. Just coming back to the question that we set ourselves, does Britain really want Ukrainian refugees? What's your impression, your overall impression, Maria?
I think Britain, if we're talking about the people, the population, the nation, they do want to help. I've seen it so many times. Like, people are just reaching out to me, even though they know I'm sorted with a home, but they're still saying, if you need anything, let me know. It's been immense. It's been so fantastic how many people have contacted me with any help, or just like, you know, little things like giving flowers and making drawings for me. Like, somebody brought a drawing made by a 5-year-old son of that person, like as a welcome home kind of thing with Ukrainian flags, and it was very, very sweet. It's just been insane how welcoming people have been. So Britain, as in British people, I think do want Ukrainian refugees. I think the British government doesn't, or at least has not shown enough to, done enough to show that they do. Like, we see all the signs by, you know, Boris Johnson and the, you know, Downing Street having the Twitter picture in the Ukrainian colors and sort of constantly repeating how they support in Ukraine, but we don't see it being, like, we don't see enough on the level of allowing Ukrainians to come in here without all these tedious processes.
Thank you. Jez, I welcome your input later, whenever you like, but I do want to come to Paul Butler, Bishop Paul Butler, if you don't mind me outing you in that way. Thanks for joining us. Can you, as a trustee of Reset, explain Reset's role in the next part of this process that is about to unfold, we hope? How does it work for Ukrainians, and how does it work for hosts?
Well, so thanks for, so yes, I'm the Bishop of Durham, so I lead on refugee matters for the Church of England. I'm a trustee of Reset, and I have to say I've been involved in conversations every single day this week with government ministers, with civil servants and so on about creating. So I've got all sorts of things I could say about comments which have already been made. Reset has been the lead body around community sponsorship up to now, which Enver mentioned earlier, and has been engaged with both the Sanctuary Foundation and then with government about looking at what does a matching system look like. So there is now a website up and running at this point for Ukrainians who want to express an interest in coming. They can go there. It probably won't be the only one. There'll probably be other matching systems. Tomorrow is the day that the government did announce that the scheme would start actually functioning. So you could register your interest, like my wife and I have, for example, as being hosts, but the scheme doesn't go live till tomorrow. So the 130,000 people, I think, will get an email likely tomorrow. So Reset's going to be involved in helping doing some of the matching. It's doing a lot of training. It's looking at what lessons have been learned through the whole community sponsorship scheme that can be passed on. Because what we would want to say as Reset, what I'd want to say as a church leader, is no individuals can do this. You can't be an individual sponsor and do this successfully. You've got to work with your friends, with your neighbours, with your church community, with your mates at work, because you will need other people to help you make Ukrainians welcome in the way that we want them to be made.
Right, you're talking about
the government's promise. It will be turned around in 24 hours within a week or so.
So you're talking about you can't, as an individual, do the job of making a refugee or refugee family welcome. It's not just the admin of getting to that point.
No. So the system is an individual sponsorship system, but I would argue, and most of us in the sector would argue, that to really help refugees feel welcome, like Maria said, lots of offers of help. So use friends and neighbours to make people feel welcome, even though you might be the host.
And I would like to invite you to respond to the whatever it was you wanted to respond to that already been said already. But first of all, just what information are Ukrainian refugees required to provide to register? Is it pretty much the same basic information that we do as potential hosts? And who does the matching if it's not an algorithm?
It's not an algorithm. It will be sponsors at this end will look at lists of people and the information that's there about them and name them. literally and say, why don't we do that? And so there's work being done by all sorts of organisations, church organisations, Citizens UK, various others, to help people do that kind of, think through that matching and what offers they might make. Quite rightly, it was pointed out that the visa application is far too long. Richard Harrington, who's been appointed as a minister in the House of Lords last night, was very clear that that should be being reduced. It's going to be available in Ukrainian so that Ukrainians can fill it in Ukrainian, not having to do so in English as well. So they are working at improving the systems. It's a heck of a lot of work, and I think they're just recognizing how much they've just bitten off in terms of the amount of work that is involved. And the safeguarding matter, absolutely, very critical. Local authorities are going to have quite a role to play in checking and vetting the housing which is on offer, and also and there'll be criminal records. I think should be done by DBS personally.
I'm staggered by what I've just heard, and I'm ashamed that I didn't know it. You said that until now, the visa application was not available in Ukrainian. What does that say about this country?
That's true. It's because we're using the system which is in place, and UK visa applications are done in English. That's the standard practice. So it's changing the practice in order to offer it to Ukrainians. So I think government people and civil sector, they're trying to be responsive to all the issues that are being raised, but they are very stretched to get to work at real pace. A lot of them haven't. The lead civil servant I know has hardly slept or seen his family for 7 days.
Okay. I hope he does, or she does, get some sleep.
He's been ordered to.
Right. Well, I think we have on the call someone from Tortoise who has been up close with people involved in this process of trying to roll out the policy. Lara, are you there? And then we can come to Matt, I hope.
Hi, yes.
Lara,
Hi.
First of all, if you can just tell us anything that you think we need to know about the logistics over the next few days, and then I'd be interested in your take on whether the whole system has been. We hear that it's trying to be responsive. Is it in any way sufficiently responsive?
Well, I mean, I agree with the point just made that people are working absolutely tirelessly in government to get this through. And in terms of the next few days, obviously by Friday, it's going live, so to speak. So we're likely to get a lot more information then. But I think the media has rightly focused on the interest and the huge amount of interest and support from the British public in showing an interest in housing refugees. I would say that actually, and I think Giles, we spoke about this earlier, but it's going to become politically quite difficult in the coming days when that number isn't translated speedily, as it is very unlikely to be, given all of the many obstacles that have been mentioned on this call already, into a kind of swift resettlement for those in need of homes. The reasons for that are complicated, but actually, I mean, we've spoken about the comments that Lisa and Andy made about this being a kind of DIY scheme, and I watched Lisa, Andy and Michael Gove in the House when this was announced a couple of days ago, and Lisa and Andy saying in quite a dramatic fashion, but can we really expect Ukrainian refugees to go on Instagram, given they've just left absolutely everything and advertise themselves? Obviously, speaking to the fact that this is, and I think this is something Matt and I have spoken about, but this is in essence a sort of privatized refugee scheme, right? If you think about it, and actually a kind of Conservative commentator wrote an article for the New Statesman, interestingly enough, today, saying that celebrating the scheme and saying that it was a chance for Conservatives to show how compassion doesn't need to rely on the state, right? And actually, the home is a very important site of compassion, and that's going to become, I think, quite an interesting dividing line. And if this policy isn't able to provide homes for those in need, and if it does fall short, as it many people are fearing that it will, then I really wouldn't rule out a change to a government-led a fully government-led resettlement scheme in the future. I don't think that's out of the question from what I've heard, at least, at all. And I think, you know, Boris Johnson's comments that we'd sort of resettled more people than any since 2015 the other day, which was obviously proven to be incorrect, I think speaks to the fact that this is going to be quite a politicized debate going forward. And it's going to be a very difficult debate for the Conservative Party to get right, because they can't, if this goes wrong, they can't blame the public, because you can't blame the public. You can't blame the many people that have come forward that will complain about bureaucracy or will say that there have been obstacles in their way. And you absolutely can't blame refugees, and you can't blame civil society organisations who have shown a huge amount of initiative and put a huge amount of effort, as we've heard on this call already, into making this scheme a success. So I think it is pretty politically perilous for the government as well if this does go wrong, and that's why I think I wouldn't rule out, should it not work in the coming weeks, and should we see a whole load of red tape and obstacles to making this work, safeguarding aside, I think you could see a radical change in the scheme itself. I wouldn't rule that out at all.
And Lara, briefly, I want to come to Johnny Levy and then Matt in a second, but if that did happen, which bits of government would the burden fall on? Central, local?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, it's a great question. But even, you know, you look at this scheme, which is, as Lisa Nandy has said, a sort of a DIY or at least a kind of partially privatized refugee scheme, and already you have DLUC brought in under Michael Gove, considered to be one of the most, if not the most, sort of effective ministers in kind of drawing up and implementing policy, but he had to work with the Home Office. We saw the tension there. It was obvious for everybody to see, and not just the Home Office, but also education, health. And so if you move to a government-backed program, you're still going to have to involve all of these various departments, and you'll see the burden very likely fall on local authorities from central government who will be, I think, probably quite overwhelmed by this. But I think in many ways, if they were to do this, it would not necessarily be more complicated, because the scheme in place currently is going to be extremely complicated. And as we've heard from the many civil servants who've had many sleepless nights over the past few weeks, there's a lot that still needs to be hashed out on this one alone.
Thank you. Well, let me come to Johnny Levy. You've mentioned in the chat previous involvement with Syrian refugees. What's on your mind?
I suppose I agree with a lot of what has been said, and particularly Lara, Paul and Enver, who've made reference to the community sponsorship scheme. And I think that is where we need to be looking, because I've got one particular friend who actually is going to get a Ukrainian refugee, by the sounds of it, next week, only because that particular refugee is the mother of somebody who's already in London. And in that particular case, the mother had a visa, a 6-month visa, and was over last December, and is able now to come immediately almost. And that particular person, when they got rung up to say, you can have somebody next week, having signed up, suddenly, not panicked, but suddenly realized the reality of the situation. And the reality of the situation is that it's not just taking somebody into your home, it's the issues around that in terms of all the supports that you will need, which has been spoken about. And that is where the community sponsorship scheme works very well. But to date, we've only brought out, I think, something like 500 people under that particular scheme, the Syrian scheme. And I've personally been involved in one where we brought a Syrian family over last year, a year ago. And that works incredibly well, not just for the family, but it actually works for the community. And what we've found is we've needed real support around it. So we've had so the community sponsorship, very quickly, just to tell people, there are 3 elements to it. 1, you have to provide a home for 2 years. 2, you have to raise £9,000. And 3, you have to form a community sponsorship group, community group around them to help support them. So in our particular case, we've got an amazing group of people. We've got a GP, we've got a deputy headmistress, we've got somebody who's an expert in universal credit. So you've got all those support systems which they need when they first arrive. Then you need to.
Can I just interrupt? Is that per individual, £9,000 per individual?
Per the family. So it's for the 2 years, the 9,000. So that would be there to cover things when they first arrive, particularly around language, maybe having interpreters, just dealing with some of the issues that the costs that you will have around that.
Is it your understanding that the Syrian model is going to be, is the model for this scheme?
We're not sure. I don't know, but to me, that is where we need to head, and we need to head that way. It is available for Afghan refugees. The difference with the Syrian refugees, why it made such a big difference, was that it was incremental, because at the time the government committed to bringing 20,000 Syrian refugees in, but they said to communities, if you bring in a family, that will be incremental to that. So in our particular case, the family we brought in, had we not brought them in, they would not be in the UK. So you're actually seeing that you're making a difference, and that makes, you know, the community feel really pleased about that, because they can look at this family who they're resettling and say they wouldn't be here but for us.
Paul, you probably know the answer to the question I just asked. Is the kind of model that Johnny just described likely to be rolled out in this case?
So yes, I mean, Reset, we do all the training for community sponsorship. So I was just about to put in the chat, it is scalable, but at the pace and with the numbers, it couldn't be as full as what Johnny's just explained. It will have to be a much lighter touch. But it goes back to my earlier point that I think a group of people acting as a community group supporting a Ukrainian family coming in is going to be much stronger and healthier and fuller and better way of welcoming them. There is a phase 2 promised by the government, and that will be part of phase 2. I'm quite confident.
With a financial threshold like that, and if so, is that not a barrier to entry?
No, the lighter touch will be in this instance the community sponsorship groups. I don't think we'll have to have any money up front at all. They will have to have at least one home sponsoring in the homes.
It's okay. Thanks. Matt, let me come to you. Try to wind you up a little bit. This is an immensely complex problem. It is likely, is it not, that the solutions are going to vary, obviously, according to the individual refugees, but also according to which parts of the country you're talking about. Therefore, is it not entirely appropriate that voluntarism and sort of flexibility is at the heart of the government response?
Well, I think in a way the answer to the question is contained in the question, which is that, of course, voluntarism is of this nature is always laudable. I mean, no one, I think, could be on principle opposed to this. Quite the opposite. It's excellent that people are offering their help and their homes, to opening them, you know, this huge humanitarian crisis and for Europe. So in the same way as it was wonderful to see people helping out with grocery and medication provision during lockdown, you know, this reflects something we should celebrate. However, I have to say, skeptical of this whole scheme for 2 reasons. One is it's the political prelude to it, which was essentially the Home Office under Priti Patel was fizzing and whirring like a dying laptop that was being asked to do something that it simply didn't understand the nature of. And that's because this whole government, and the Home Office specifically, has its deepest roots in opposition to immigration, in the Brexit referendum of 2016. And everything it has done, apart from occasional rhetoric, you know, at moments of crisis, as with the retreat from Kabul and so on, has been geared to minimizing the influx of migrants and refugees. And at the moment, Priti Patel is steering a very tough nationality and borders bill through Parliament, consistent with that original aim, and has repeatedly, though with no enthusiasm from the Royal Navy, tried to militarize the channel and actually stop these poor souls coming over in dinghies using shovels as oars from being able to get across to the British Isles. So the Home Office really had a kind of a structural psychological difficulty coping with this, at which point enter Michael Gove, who undoubtedly has brought, because he's intelligent, because he has a seriousness, as Lara was talking about, has given at least the impression of coherence, and indeed I think, you know, he's acting in good faith. I think he will want to see this problem solved. The difficulty is that, to my mind, at any rate, asylum and refugee policy is one of those things that essentially has to be overseen by the state. You know, in the same way as you don't necessarily call your local faith group if your house is on fire. I think that at least at the helm, there has to be quite a lot of regulation, direction, and financial support from the state. This is not something that you can, as Richard Harrington has used the word, this tends towards the privatization of resettlement. And that's a worrying word to use in this context, because what it does is it encourages buy-in. Yes, it encourages localization, all of which are good. But what it lacks is central coordination. And everyone we've heard speaking with such knowledge, and it's been fascinating. The refrain has been, we don't know, you know, or we're waiting to hear. And these are not small, the questions that they're waiting to hear the answers to are not small issues. I mean, the question of safeguarding is monumentally important when you think of the condition that these refugees are going to be arriving in, women and children who've been through traumatic journeys one can only imagine. And lots of things are absolutely and totally unclear. Now, again, I stop where I started, which is no one can be opposed to voluntarism, but voluntarism under an umbrella of very clear centralized responsibility. The risk with all of this is that it is essentially a shop window scheme designed to imply that the British public have bought into this, which I think they have, but also that the government has sort of done enough, which it hasn't. And that's my principal gripe.
I'd like to come back to Daniel in just a second, but Matt, briefly, from what the vibes you're picking up from contacts, are you hearing what Lara's hearing, namely that in fact, possibly the direction of travel as people grapple with the realities of this thing and the complexities of it will be towards more government control and less voluntarism?
Well, yes, in this sense that this scheme has been wholly driven by a perceived, a real political problem, which is that there was real panic in Number 10 that the Home Office simply wasn't capable of running this, and that, you know, Priti Patel had been caught out again and again in the House of Commons, misleading the House about the existence of a reception centre at Calais, which didn't exist, and the structural disinclination of the Home Office to do anything about this. So this is a political scheme which will be the future of which will be determined by its political success. If 6 weeks from now there are lots of fantastic, heartwarming stories about Ukrainian families settling in, well, one hopes that's the case, then it will be allowed to continue. But Lara's right. If there are already glitches, it is extremely easy to see this government, which is populist before everything else, just doing a handbrake turn and trying to nationalize the whole thing. So I wouldn't rule that out at all. What I would love to see is the clarity that everyone involved has asked for. What I fear is that we'll end up with more fudging, more problems, and U-turns or even S-turns. Thank
you, Matt. Daniel, you said at the top, safeguarding cannot be secondary. We've heard how the UK government's response broadly has been slower than that of other European countries, frankly, geographically inevitable, I suppose that is. Is it possible that in taking its time and trying to untangle the complexities of the challenge, this country might actually get the safeguarding part right, or are you very concerned?
I'm very concerned at the moment with where it's going. I do agree with what Bishop Butler said about the way the community groups work and that side of things, but without the DBS checks in place, without those safeguards in place and local authorities being involved right from the very beginning for where people are placed and being able to do the full checks, whatever happens, there's still going to be gaps, there's still going to be safeguarding issues. Now, if they're involved from the very beginning, you can minimize those, and it makes it a lot smoother. As I said before, you're not bolting it on later on down the line when you see that the problems are starting to come up. But if they're involved and really pushing, not just in the framing of it, but I mean, once it's launched, then we can start to see potentially minimization.
Looking across the continent, the world, are there examples of best practice that you wish people in a position to form policy now were following, or is best British practice in fact best practice? You just have to put it into practice.
I think that at the moment, because of the nature of the situation, because it's so fast moving, you can't say that anywhere's doing best practice. Even with the UK, everyone's doing the best they can, but there's no way you can really say best practice. There's still so many issues which could be solved using our organisation as part of the European Guardianship Network. I mean, we deal with a lot of organisations across the EU looking at safeguarding. And there are, again, the same models, the same mechanisms that could be implemented. It's just trying to scale them up. It's trying to get the investment and the resources into them fast enough to ensure that they can provide the protection.
Thank you. Before we run out of time, I'd like to ask you and Paul and Maria a slightly difficult question, but it's one that's been hovering in the penumbra of this debate from the beginning. Is the UK paying more attention to this refugee crisis than to the Afghan or Syrian crises before, because the refugees are, as one person put it, so white? Is there a racial component to this?
I think there is, but also people pay more attention when things are happening closer to them, that it becomes more relevant to them. So I think there is potentially for a lot of people, but there's also for the vast majority, I would hope, it's because it's something that they can see happening almost on their doorstep rather than far away. It's not a great way of looking at it, but I think that's what everyone does in their own ways at times.
I'm just very struck by the numbers. It was 500 or 700 Syrian families resettled in total since 2015, compared with a projected number in the tens, hundreds of thousands under this scheme. I may be off base. Paul, Butler, Maria, Johnny, do you have any views on this?
So can I correct you? There's 20,000 Syrians resettled through the resettlement scheme, and about up to 800 have come through specifically through community sponsorship. So that's. I think Daniel's absolutely right. I think it's there's always a likelihood that there's a bit of a race element going on, but it's primarily because it's on the continent of Europe, and there's an underlying unease. What if this broke out of Ukraine? What might this mean? Might this lead to war in Europe, which none of the other conflicts would ever? That I think drives it more than a race question.
And since you've brought it back to geography, and both of you, and I absolutely agree, it's critically important. Let me bring it back to sort of where we started. Maria, I do want to give you the last word since you've lived all this, but since the question is, does Britain really want Ukrainian refugees? Thought experiment, if this country were part of continental Europe and had a land border with the war zone, do you think that its response to the crisis would have been radically, fundamentally different. Paul first.
If we were forget a land border, if we were still part of the EU, we would have functioned differently because the rules would have been different. Possibly, if we were joined by land as well, that would make an even bigger difference. Of course, we are joined by land to Europe, and it is one of the questions that's unresolved, is Ireland is operating a different system from the UK, and there is no border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. But sorry, I've just introduced a whole other complexity to the thing.
Thank you. Maria, you made the point earlier. We're just a minute over, so I guess we've got about a minute to run if we allow ourselves to eat into the clock a little bit. That the people that you have encountered since your return have been great. What is your lasting impression of the system and the government, which, as Matt pointed out, has deep roots in anti-immigrant policies? Do you sense that changing? Do you sense a fundamental change in mood on the part of the state, or are the roots still visible?
Well, it feels like the UK government works quite well under pressure. So I feel like there is a lot of pressure from the population, from the UK population, to make it easier for Ukrainians to come to the UK. So I feel like, yeah, if this pressure continues, and it feels like it will continue because the situation in Ukraine is not getting better yet, I feel like things will probably get better on the government level.
Works well under pressure. It's all too true. For a long time, we've had prime ministers who infamously operated by what they used to know at school and university as essay crises. Perhaps I'm simplifying it too much. It is clear, as we've heard from Paul and others, that those in the hot seat right now are working very hard. It's 3 minutes past 7:30. Thank you all very much for helping us try to understand this. I think the problem can still be seen at three levels: the response of people, the response of government, the response of the bureaucracy in between. And it is heartening to hear not only of the flowers and drawings given to Maria since her return to Manchester, but also the civil servants working 24/7 to try and solve this problem. It is unarguable that for whatever reason, the UK is responding on a very different cadence to the rest of Europe, possibly largely a function of geography, though, as Zav points out in the chat, geography may be somewhat a proxy for race. That and the Irish question are related but separate ones that I'm sure we can get into in other thinkings. But in the meantime, thank you very much for some really important reminders that we are dealing, for example, as Hannah put it, with people with complex traumas. As Daniel said, that safeguard cannot be a secondary issue. And as Johnny said, this is more than just having somebody in your home, and to make people really welcome, the whole community has to be involved. That is surely true. And what remains to be seen is exactly how we're going to figure that out. And we're a long way from doing so. Let's hope we muddle through. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, but in particular, Daniel, Enver, Maria, and Hannah, who had to leave us, and everyone who joined in the chat. Thank you for what's been a very illuminating conversation, for me at any rate. Good night.